えそれでは、後半、第2部に、入らさせて、いただきます。後半、第2部はですね、ラウンドテーブル、New Phase of Corporate Governance Reform and New Capitalism と題しましてですね、ジュリアン・フランク先生、マルコ・ベヒト先生に加えてですね、GPIF の塩村さん、それから東京大学の田中先生にですね、お越しいただいて、4人でですね、ラウンドテーブルをですね、進めたいと思います。モデレーターは私と鈴木先生が進めさせていただきます。まず最初にですね、3つの報告をですね、聞いていただきましてですね、東京大学の田中航先生に、法学者、会社法学を専攻する立場からですね、コメントをいただいて、それを皮切りにですね、少しディスカッションをしたいと思います。それでは、田中先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Hello, everyone. My name is Wataru Tanaka. I'm a law professor, and I do research mainly on corporate law and commercial law. In my comment, I would first like to talk about my general impression about recent development of corporate governance, and then I will make comments on each of 3 presentations in the last session given by Professor Franks, Professor Suzuki, and Professor Best. Okay. It seems to me that nowadays good corporate governance is expected to achieve 3 different goals. 1, to discipline management, and second, to overcome short-termism of the capital market and enhance long-term firm value, and third, to assure sustainable development of society by solving various problems, various environmental and social problems. And structuring corporate governance to tackle all these problems is a very difficult task, since taking one governance measure to solve one problem may aggravate another problem. For example, issuing loyalty shares with 10-year voting, which was introduced by Professor Becht, may encourage long-term shareholder engagement and mitigate the problem of short-termism, but it may also increase shareholders who are loyal to managers, not loyal to firms, and which will have a negative impact on disciplining management. Considering these side effects in pursuing broader governance goals, it may be good for corporate governance to focus on a narrow, more traditional goal, that is, to discipline management. Actually, I am sympathetic with this view. However, more and more people seem to pursue broader goals, such as Professor Hart and Professor Zingers, who write a famous article in 2017. And they do, perhaps for good reasons. Environmental and social issues may be so important that we do not like to leave those issues often dysfunctional political and regulatory process. Rather, we have to solve those problems, or at least we like to help solve these problems by good governance structures. So if we want to construct corporate governance system to achieve such broader goals, we must be very careful to analyze costs and benefits of various governance measures. And empirical studies, which are presented today's symposium, are extremely important to conduct such proper cost-benefit analysis. This is my general impression. And then let me move to comment to each presenter. First, I'd like to make a comment to internal market for corporate control and stock repurchase presented by Professor Franks. Well, and this is an empirical study on Japanese firms' stock repurchase and the subsequent uses of treasury shares. And that reports that Japanese firms often use treasury shares they acquired by quasi-private transactions through Toastnets in private placements for strategic reasons. And those transactions in combine enhance shareholder values on average. And this result is very interesting, especially for corporate law scholars like me, because many corporate law scholars tend to view both share repurchases and also private placements with considerable skepticism that they could be motivated by private interests of managers. And I also think this study will contribute to the hypothesis in finance literature that firms serve as market makers in repurchasing their own shares. Market makers fill the gaps between supply and demands. And when insiders of a firm, such as banks or insurance companies and other business organizations, want to sell their shares in the firm, they may have difficulty in finding buyers. And if they sell a large block of shares on the market, it will have a negative impact on the market price and cause a loss to those insiders, which might discourage insiders from selling their shares in the first place. And in such a case, a firm can serve as a market maker, repurchase its own shares from insiders, and hold those shares as inventory, waiting for the opportunity to use them for future value-enhancing transactions. Well, let me make some comments or some cautious views about Professor Frank's presentation. First is round trippings really beneficial for shareholder value, or are these always beneficial for shareholders' value? When I read the discussion paper by Professor Franks and Professor Miyajima and others, I find that quite a few firms use treasury shares in public offerings. And public offerings will cause negative cumulative abnormal returns. And also, even when firms use treasury shares in private placements, sometimes they allot shares to parties who have already had cross-shareholding relationship with firms, in which case CRAs will also be negative. So my question is, how should we interpret these results? Perhaps some transactions in own shares are motivated to enhance shareholders' value, while others motivated by private interests of managers. This is one possible interpretation, and I'd like to ask Professor Franks more. And another the second question is for a question for future research, and I'd like to know that private placement for strategic regions are also beneficial for long term. Some of the cases of strategic alliance discussed in the presentation resulted in a failure. Like Suzuki and Volkswagen, which in my understanding resulting in the failure, and Suzuki repurchased the share which it had issued to Volkswagen. So I am eager to know the long-term effect of those transactions. Well, next, I'd like to make a comment to shareholder activism in Japan, quiet versus public activism by Professor Suzuki. This study conducts research on quiet engagement activities by governance for owners, GO, and compare them with public activism. And the study finds quiet engagement by GO Japan works well. The success rate is higher than public activism, and it enjoys higher buy and hold abnormal returns than public activism. And this is a very variable study on quiet activism, which can only be conducted with confidential information. Such a kind of study was once conducted by Professor Becht and Professor Franks and others on Hermes UK in 2008 article, and this study was another variable example of quiet activism or engagement, and also data on BHARs are also very helpful because in Japan, such a long-term results of shareholder activism is still rare. Okay, and well, I'd like to make some comment. What worries me the most is a title of his presentation, "Quiet versus Public," and his original presentation materials, which Professor Suzuki gave me, included a slide about the sun and the north wind. Of course, the sun represents quiet activism, and the north wind represents public activism. But is this an appropriate way of comparison? Quiet activism and public activism opposing alternatives, rather, and they complementary methods to discipline the management. In my understanding, especially in the United States, many activists now reach settlement with the farms, and they do probably because if the disputes between activists and the farms go public, activists are more likely to win proxy contests with the support of institutional investors than they used to. So farms or farms management cannot help making compromise with activists. So in my understanding, the success of quiet activism depends on the very existence of public activism. So I understand both quiet and public activism are important to discipline management. Well, I'd like to ask Professor Suzuki about your idea. And third, I'd like to make a comment to loyalty shares with the tenure voting, the new dual class presented by Professor Becht. It is also a very informative overview of loyalty shares, dual class shares, loyalty shares, and practical developments about ESG activities or sustainability. And he gave us inconvenient conclusion. ESG does not come free, CEMs can entrench in irresponsible behavior of management, and it is painful to abandon fossil fuels, plastics, and sugars, etc. And I strongly agree. Pursuing broader goals of corporate governance requires careful balancing of interests, and there is no panacea. And but I'd like to ask Professor Best one question. In Japan, dual class shares are legally permissible, and loyalty shares with 10-year voting are also possible by use of convertible shares. But uses of them by listed companies are very rare. Actually, I find only one example, one IPO by the company named Cyberdyne in 2014 or 2015, but I find no other example. And in Japan, negative side effects, there is entrenching management of those special voting structure are often emphasized. And Japanese institutional investors are so anxious about these side effects, and they seem to not, they don't seem to like to buy shares in those firms with those special voting structure. And on the other hand, dual class shares or loyalty shares are more widely used in European countries, such as France or Netherlands. So my question is, what explains such a variety in countries? Even in European countries, there seems to considerable variety. So for the variety comes from some economic or political or culture or historical reasons? That is my question. I'd like to stop the comment here. Thank you very much.
田中先生、どうもありがとうございます。非常にですね、丁寧に読んでいただきましてですね、いろいろなですね、論点を提示していただいたと思います。それでは、いくつか、コメント出てますのでですね、まず、ジュニアン先生からですね、リプライしていただくということにいたしましょう。Could you please reply to Tanaka's comment?
Well, Professor Tanaka, thank you so much for your comments. I don't want to, I hope I don't have to pay you the amount of time you spent preparing these comments, because they really are detailed and insightful. So thank you. I'm going to answer each of them in. Okay. So I'm going to answer each of them in turn. I agree with you that the use of treasury stock in placements should be greeted initially with skepticism. After all, if we were in the United States, we would like repurchases to be cancelled. That stops management discretion. By holding them in treasury, you really are giving management discretion. So your initial skepticism, I think, is justified. I take away, of course, our result is that it's kind of the opposite. On average, their value increasing. But still, an interesting question is, why are they placement value increasing when previously cross-holdings were observed to be value reducing? And the only explanation at the moment I can come up with is that the environment for the last 5-6 years is more sensitive to outside shareholders, increasing foreign shareholders' activism, and that puts a discipline on management. The second thing is, and you're absolutely right, that you want to buy, you don't want blocks to go into the market, because that will cause liquidity problems and lead to a decline in price. So the idea of market makers buying blocks, inventorying and selling them it's an important motivation. What I think is interesting is the way you put it, that management is inventorying the blocks. They're playing the role of the market maker. You gave a perfect description. What is interesting is this is very unusual. Market makers are not usually the management of the companies. They're independent market makers, you know, in the stock market. So it's unusual. And I think in the United States and the UK, I think it would be interesting. My guess is the response to managers playing the role of market makers would be greeted. I think people would be uncomfortable. They would be uncomfortable. But I think you've described it very well. You say again, and I think you're right, that although on average private placements are profitable, there must be some that are not profitable. We know that. And it's an interesting question whether we can identify ex ante the ones, or partition the ones that will be profitable and the ones that will not be. I haven't, and you're quite right in saying, well, where the purchaser has an existing holding, certainly the private placements are less profitable. You're quite right. So trying to understand what's going on there a bit more, I think, is a very good suggestion. And finally, you point out that some of these strategic alliances have failed, and you quote the Volkswagen one. You're quite right. There is, of course, a difference between how the stock market views these alliances and joint ventures at the time they're announced. Let's call those the ex ante abnormal returns, and the ex post experience of whether these transactions in the long run succeed or fail. It's rather like the announcement effects on mergers when they're announced, and then the post-merger performance after the event. And what you're saying is, it would be interesting to know not just what are the announcement effects of these placements, but tell us, how do they perform ex post? And that's a good suggestion. I fear you may have given me quite a lot of work there. Thank you very much.
先生、今の、リプライで何か、もう少し聞いておきたいというかあったら、ご遠慮なく、いかがですか？いいですか？それでは、鈴木さんに質問が届いてますけれども、それにお答えいただければと思います。
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tanaka. It was a pleasure. It was an honor that you have read my presentation, which is still premature work, and had very valuable comments. About this slide, North Wind and the Sun, we were asked by our co-authors to remove. It's a bit tricky. And I agree that there are a lot of complementary elements between these public activism and private activism. From what I have observed myself as a practitioner, in the first generation, my understanding is that they just come banging on your door to change. They don't really negotiate. Either you take it or leave it type of discussion was the norm. But nowadays, as Shimura-san asked, there are more and more activists who pre-negotiate and try to change the management behind the closed doors. So it's becoming, in a sense, more complementary, and I agree with that. But on the other hand, if you look at the statistics of the outcome records, it is still 11% that the management agrees, or at the shareholders meeting, the proposal from the shareholders are passed. If you look at what happened in this year, the passing rate is 0. Okay? Nothing was passed. So if you believe that institutional investors are dancing with activists. We should observe more passing of those proposals, but that hasn't happened. So there is some element of the not necessarily complementary, but once you go out public, then general support from the institutional investors is still very low, around at maximum 30% if you include everything. So I think although I agree, but we are not yet at that stage to dance with activists. Many institutional investors are disclosing their voting records. So they know that everyone else will know that they have voted no to the proposal of activists, but they are still voting no. So we may not have reached that stage yet. That's my response. Whether I replied correctly or not, but that's my impression at the moment. Thank you.
Do you have any 田中さん何かリプライが。
Yes, my impression is that although activism is become active in Japan as well as the US, there is still a big difference between Japanese and American activism. One big difference is that when disputes between the management and activists go public and there are proxy contests. In the United States, the winning rate of activists is pretty high. And in Japan, it's very low. It's still very low. Of course, in some disputes, some disputes reach compromise before proxy contest. Management expects the results of proxy contest. So, because for example. Losing a proxy context is very ashaming to management. So management has every incentive to reach settlement. But even considering that the winning rate is still low, and actually this concerns me because management, and if confronting activism is not successful, managers have still a low incentive to listen to quiet activists. They might they accept what quiet activists say only when the managers themselves want to do it. Because I am anxious about still low profitability of Japanese firms. So I think activism is now active. That's a good thing, but still something is needed in Japanese economy.
Yes, I totally agree. I think I'm in the same position as the Professor Tanaka. I've been long term. The only thing is my question is probably my puzzle at this moment is that why so many institutional investors are not supporting the activist proposal. That's more probably important than the activist activities itself. While historically, due to the first generation of activists, the activist generally has very bad image. Maybe Professor Franks will cite the Elliott's example. So they have very bad reputation. So for Japanese institutional investors, it may be difficult to vote for the proposal of some of the activists because you're perceived as taking the side of the ones who are aggressive, greedy, and whatever, the impression that they have.
ありがとうございます。それでは、少し、時間も迫ってきましたので、マルコさんにお答えいただくということで。Please.
So let me just join and say thank you for your comments. You could see the lawyer coming through because you clearly understand all the details about dual class and tenure voting. So let me deal with your question about Europe in two parts. So the first question is, should you put dual class and tenure voting on the books? So should you make it available in corporate law and through listing rules? So can you, in your own national corporate law, have these devices or not? And then can you, when you have them, list with them, and where can you list? Now, in Italy, Belgium, Spain, tenure voting was not available. You couldn't have that kind of statute. So what these countries have done is put this on the books in their corporate law. That doesn't mean that then companies will actually choose tenure voting. So it's a two-step question. The first question is, is it available in your own corporate law? And the second question is, are companies then going to use it? In the case of France, where it was always available, about 50%, just under 50% of IPOs go to market with a tenure voting structure. So it's actually quite popular, and there are statistics on Italy as well, where it's not quite as popular, but people make use of it. The second question is, does your stock exchange allow to list? So the UK, for example, you could always have dual class. There's some companies that have dual class, like the General Mail, the Daily Mail General Trust. The question is, can you list them or not? So the UK debate was, what about the listing rules? So in Europe, you can, of course, go to the Netherlands. You're an Italian company, you go to the Netherlands and you incorporate there, and you can always get this. But that's costly. Take, for example, Exor, the holding company of the Agnelli family. They went to the Netherlands, got tenure voting, and then listed back in Italy. That's quite costly. So what they've done just last year or this year is they are now listed in Amsterdam. So they're incorporated in Amsterdam of tenure voting, and then are listed in Amsterdam. So in the EU, that's not a problem. Now, when you're talking about Japan, the question is, and that's really a legal question, you said dual class is available, tenure voting is available in principle, so that's good. I don't know about the listing rules. Could you list in Japan with these structures? And if you can't list in Japan, could you list somewhere else? So that's a question back to you. And then on your argument that people don't buy these things, that's actually not true. So if you take, for example, GPIF, sorry to bring in GPIF, but if you have if you invest in a global index, there are very few indices that exclude dual class, and I don't know of any indices that exclude tenure voting. So if you're a unicorn and you go to market and you're large enough to be included in a big index, GPIF will buy your dual class, and they will also buy your tenure voting. And GPIF, I'm singling out GPIF because you're here, but Norges Bank, same thing. Okay, so all the big pension funds will buy you, and BlackRock, tracker indices will buy you. So you have no shortage of demand for your shares. So I'd rather turn the question around and say, why are Japanese unicorns not listing using tenure voting or dual class? What prevents them from doing that? So I'd rather turn the question around and ask you, why are they not doing it, rather than, should they do it or not?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask someone for this question, in Japan, in my understanding, there is no legal obstacle to have dual voting structures, and also it is possible to use tenure voting. And as for listing rules, Tokyo Stock Exchange has had a long history to ban dual class dual voting structures. But I remember that in 2010, or Tokyo Stock Exchange changed its attitude and has a position to permit such dual voting systems, at least in the IPO stage. So the real question is why Japanese investors do not like to buy those shares, those unicorns. My understanding is if you have Amazon or Google or Facebook, then investors want to buy those shares. They really trust Mike Zuckerberg or sorry, I mentioned Google's founders, but maybe Japanese investors do not trust Japanese founders, and they have confidence in. They don't have such confidence in the Japanese founders. I'd like to ask investors.
一番難しい問題は私にもちょっと非常に答えづらいところではありますけれども、田中先生の今お話しされたことは、個人的に、あと直感的な感触で言うと、合ってるのかなとは思います。っていうのはやはり、リアルクラス、処理株とか、そういったものについては、やっぱりそこの経営者に対する信頼感、カリスマ性があって、そういう株主の制限があったとしても、信用してくれるかと。それだけの成長力がある。そこを任せてくれって言える、企業であれば、そういったことを、感受して、いいとは思わないにしても、感受して買う投資家っていうのはいるんだと思うんですけども、そこまでちょっと日本の今の、スタートアップが、カリスマ性があって、強い成長、ユニコーンみたいなものがないっていうのが、現状なのかなというふうには思っております。
Well, to me, it looks as if it was not the investors. There's demand by investors. That's my thesis. I think it must have something to do with Japanese entrepreneurs not wanting to adopt these structures. Because as I said, there is demand for this. And I think if you look at China, there's certainly Chinese entrepreneurs that go to NASDAQ and list with dual class on NASDAQ. So there is a demand. If you have a good company, a good story, a good IPO, and you want to go to market with tenure voting or dual class, there will be investors who will want to buy the shares. It must have something to do with the entrepreneurs. Maybe it's that Japanese entrepreneurs haven't received the memo. So let me just give you an example. I had the fortune of, I had the good luck of having been invited to dinner with Gildo Zegna, who's the controlling shareholder of Emilio Zegna, the Italian clothes company. He is listed with tenure voting. He has a tenure voting structure in the Netherlands, which, by the way, you wouldn't know about because you have to look very carefully. It's not like dual class. And he is listed on NASDAQ. I asked him, how did you come up with this idea? And he said, oh, I talked to Marchione. Who's Marchione? He's the former CEO of Fiat. So he didn't know about this before. He's an entrepreneur. He cares about selling suits. He doesn't actually care about these things, you know. But then he heard this from Marchione, and then he told the lawyers, oh, please do this for me. This is a great idea. And then a SPAX came along and said, oh, we would like to list you. And he said, yeah, let's do the deal with the SPAX, but I want tenure voting. And that's what he did. So maybe this is a business opportunity for lawyers in Tokyo to actually spread the word, and we'll just take 2 or 3 and them learning how good this is, that you might actually have an avalanche of people going to market. Professor Franks is skeptical, but you know, anyway, that's my thesis. Anyway, to summarize, to me, it looks more like being an issue on the Japanese entrepreneur side, that they don't want to adopt these structures rather than the market not wanting to buy.
Oh, yes, please.
sorry, it is one of Japanese management has a history of not being very sensitive to outside shareholders. So I think history and culture is important here. Whereas in America and other European countries, there's a different history. So it may come, but people have got to trust management not to use this to entrench. And I think that that's important. The history and culture of the country has to be taken into account.
議論が尽きないところですけれども、ロイヤルティシェアの問題、手に、とどまっているわけにいかないのでですね、少しですね、論点を移しまして、冒頭お話ししましたようにですね、所有構造自身は、いわゆるユニバーサルオーナーですかね、金融資産の蓄積水準が上がって、その背後にはですね、年金資産の蓄積があるということで、そうしたですね、変化の側面を我々も、明らかにして考えてみたいということでですね、本日はGPIF からですね、塩村さんにお越しいただいております。塩村さんにですね、近年のですね、GPIF の特に ESG に関するですね、取り組みについてですね、ご説明いただいて、少しディスカッションさせていただきたいと思いますので、よろしくお願いします。
本日は、この機会いただきましてありがとうございます。著名な先生方の前でお話をさせていただきますので、今日はアカデミアの方に、期待したいことも含めてちょっとお話をさせていただきたいというふうに思っております。で、GPIF に関しては、ご案内の方も多いと思いますけれども、簡単にご説明させていただきたいというふうに思います。私どもは厚生年金と、国民年金の、積立金を運用している、法人でございまして、運用資産は約200兆円弱、ございます。世界で一番大きな投資家というふうに言われておりますが、保有している株式は6000弱、債券は15000ということで、運用資産が巨額であるがゆえにですね、全世界に、分散して投資を行っているという特徴があります。いわゆる典型的なユニバーサルオーナーということなんだろうと思います。世界の経済の成長の果実を得ていくというような投資スタイルで運用を行っております。で、また、私どもの組織はですね、のミッションは何かというと、その積立金を安定的に運用していって、100年先まで持たせていくというのがミッションであります。で、この100年というのが、5年に一度、私どもの年金財政、財政検証、行われる財政検証の中で、年金積立金の見通しというものが、立てられております。で、その中では、経済前提によって5つのシナリオが置かれておりますけれども、その真ん中の、注意のシナリオでいきますと、これから、年金積立金は積み上がっていって、2079年度にピークを迎える。その時には479兆円まで拡大するというふうに試算をされております。で、2079年度まで積立金がどんどん積み上がっていくという状況ですので、今、世界の国々がネットゼロを目指している2050年、こういったものはもう私どものその投資の、もう期間の範囲内にも入ってきているというところですので、この ESG の課題のような長期的な問題については、私どもの投資の中心に据えて、投資の判断に考慮しているということであります。で、私どもの投資の基本的な原則という、投資原則にもですね、この ESG について規定されております。この投資原則の4に、投資先及び市場全体の持続的成長が運用資産の長期的な投資収益の拡大に必要であるとの考え方を踏まえ、被保険者の利益のために長期的な収益を確保する観点から財務的な要素に加えて非財務的要素である ESG を考慮した投資を推進すると いうふうに書かれています。当たり前のことを書いているように思われるかもしれませんけれども、非常に重要なことが書かれておりまして、被保険者の利益のために長期的な収益を確保する観点から ESG を考慮するというふうに書かれていますので、これは社会的な課題解決を目的に ESG 投資を行うわけではなくて、ESG を考慮した投資をすることが、被保険者の経済的な利益のためになるのであれば、そちらを考慮するということが書かれております。これは私どもの本当に基本的なスタンスというところになります。その中で、私どもが行っている ESG 投資ですけれども、私どもの投資の、いろいろな、組織のその特徴もですね、かなりユニークだと思いますけれども、行っている投資も、それにあってですね、ユニークになっております。で、一つは、ESG 指数に基づくパッシブ運用です。で、我々は、法令でですね、個別銘柄の選択が禁止されています。インハウスの運用が禁じられています。そういうこともあって、我々が投資の意思決定というか、我々の考えを反映するのは、やはりインデックスを採用するっていう行為になってきますので、そういった観点で、この ESG に限らずですね、インデックスに関する、選定ですとか、あとは指数会社へのエンゲージメント、こういったものについて非常に積極的に行っております。これは、世界でもかなり、珍しいことなのかなというふうに考えております。その中で、採用している ESG 指数というのは現在、8つありまして、この資料の左側にありますのが、総合型の ESG 指数で、ESG 要素を総合的に評価したもの。右側にありますのがテーマ型の指数で、今採用しているものとしては、気候変動の問題を考慮したもの、あとは女性の活躍に関する指数、こういったもので運用をしております。で、その指数に基づく運用はですね、年々拡大をしておりまして、今年の3月時点では 12.1 兆円まで運用資産を拡大しています。また、株式以外でも ESG を考慮した投資というのは行っておりまして、グリーンボンド、サステナビリティボンド、ソーシャルボンドの、ESG 債、いわゆる ESG 債については、同じく今年の3月で 1.6 兆円まで運用資産を拡大をしております。こういった投資が我々の、直接的ですね、協議の ESG 投資というふうに言えると思いますけれども、それ以外にもですね、間接的には ESG を考慮した取り組みというのは、積極的に行っています。その一つが、エンゲージメントということになりますけれども、これは、GPIF のその、インベストメントチェーンにおける立ち位置を示したものになりますが、我々は、真のアセットオーナーとここでは書いてますが、年金の拠出者から、年金保険料を、お預かりして、その資金を、外部の運用会社にお預けして、運用会社が最終的な投資判断をして、投資先企業を選ぶということをやっております。先ほど簡単に申し上げましたけれども、私どもは、運用資産があまりに巨額であるということもありますので、投資先企業を直接選んではいけない。左側に×印が書いてますけれども、それは民間企業の経営に過度に影響を与えないということから、そういう法令で縛りがあるということです。ただだからといって何もできないかというと、そういうわけではなくてですね、私どもはその経済の成長の果実を得るという投資スタイルですので、このインベストメントチェーンがうまく回るということが、私どもの投資収益に直結するわけですので、そのための取り組みというのは、非常に積極的に行っています。それが運用会社に対するエンゲージメントでありまして、その運用会社さんが、しっかり投資先企業に、建設的な、対話をしているかどうかということが、我々のそのインベストメントチェーンを回す上での非常に重要なキーとなっております。そういうこともありまして、この法令上の制約でですね、 こうした企業と直接コンタクトを、あんまりできないということもありますので、運用会社さんには、毎年、アンケートを行っております。そのアンケートは、その実際のこの対話の、現状を、調べるということもありますし、あとは我々はアセットマネージャーさんとは、対話を、しょっちゅう行っておりますけれども、その話が本当かどうかという、裏取りの意味もあって、360度評価ということも言えると思いますけれども、その観点から、上場会社にもアンケートを行って、それを毎年、公表しております。もう一つ、私どもの、特徴的な、独特な取り組みとしてはですね、エンゲージメント強化型パッシブというものを2018年度から行っております。これは、しっかりとエンゲージメントを行っていただけるパッシブ運用会社を選定して、通常のパッシブ運用の報酬とは異なる報酬体系で、設定してですね、エンゲージメント計画における KPI 達成状況などを確認して評価をするというような取り組みになっております。で、現在はここに挙げている4つの運用会社さんを採用させていただいております。で、この取り組みに関してはですね、かなり独特だと思います。フリーライドし放題なんですよね。で、ここに追加のフィーを払うっていうのは正当な判断じゃないんじゃないかというふうに思われるかもしれませんけれども、これは私どもだけかもしれませんが、非常に価値があるというか、賞賛がある取り組みじゃないかと私個人では考えておりまして、それは私ども国内株式に50兆円運用をしております。で、仮にですけども、それがトピックス型のパッシブが多いわけですけど、トピックスが50兆円あるとして、1% この取り組みによって、パフォーマンスが変われば5000億円です。1ベーシスでも50億円。ここに追加コストを払う意味っていうのはやっぱりあるんじゃないかとも考えてやっております。で、ただこの取り組みに関しては、やはりその効果検証ということが、難しい問題ですので、後ほどその点についてお話をさせていただきたいと思います。で、このエンゲージメント強化型パッシブに限らずですね、私どもの ESG に関する取り組みを、検証する。この ESG 投資の PDCA サイクルを回すために、毎年評価を行っております。で、ESG 投資に限らずですけども、投資の目的は最終的な経済的なリターンなわけですけれども、ただ ESG に関しては、その取り組みが効果を出すまではですね、相当な時間がかかるということで、この右の歯車にありますように、まずはこの投資行動によって、企業の ESG 評価が変わったかとか、企業の行動変容があるのかどうか、そういったことについて、分析をすると。で、それをその投資に反映していくというのが、今行っていることであります。また、2018年度からは、TCFD 提言に沿った気候変動リスク、機会に関する取り組みについても、かなり詳しく、分析をさせていただいております。で、今日ですね、先生方にいろいろご意見をいただきたいところとしては、この ESG 投資の課題というところで3つ、ご用意をしておりますので、そこでご議論いただければと思います。課題の一つに関しては、もう有名な話だと思いますので、簡単にいきますと、これ2017年に ESG 投資を我々は採用したときに、もうその時に最初から問題意識として掲げていました。それは私どもが採用したフッチーさんと MSCI さんの ESG の評価があまりにばらけているということですね。これは本当は最初にこれ出して、採用の時にこれを出したわけですけど、これも多分批判があるだろうなと思ったんですね。こんな修練していないものに、投資をするっていうこと自体何事かっていう、お叱りを受けるかなというふうに思いながらも、やっぱり問題提起することは大事だと思って出しました。でそこで、掲げたこのバラバラの原因の仮説としては、ESG 情報の開示が足りない。で、二つ目が、ESG 情報開示の基準がバラバラ。 これについては、足元ですね、ISSB の動きなどもありますので、若干前進が期待できるのかなというふうに思います。で、3つ目は ESG 評価手法がまだ精度としては低いのかなということで、こちらについても課題意識を示させていただきました。ただ、この相関に関しては実は少しずつ改善していますので、これはESG 投資自体が定着しつつあることの所作なのかなというふうに考えております。2つ目の課題ですけども、短期リスクと長期リスクのトレードオフ。これは非常に難しい問題です。で、ショートターム、短期のリスクに関しては、トラッキングエラーということで、ヒストリカルでも出ますし、推計トラッキングエラーであれば、今現在どうかということすぐにわかります。一方、長期的なリスクについては、気候変動のリスクなどにもそうですけれども、今後10年、20年先に顕在化するであろう非常に大きなリスクになるわけですが、そこに対してはまだデータの品質も、それほど高くない。またシナリオがどうなってくる。どういうシナリオに基づいて今後将来進んでいくのか。政策リスクが大きくなるのか、物理的リスクが大きくなるのか。そういったものについて非常に不確かな中で、この不確かな長期的なリスク、非常に大きな問題ですけど、それと短期的なリスクをどうバランスしていくのかというのは非常に難しい問題だというふうに思いますし、これの理解がないとですね、運用はうまくいかないということだと思います。例えば足元の、ロシアによるウクライナ侵攻によって、化石燃料価格が上がって、例えばダイベストメントをしている投資家は短期的にはリスクにさらされたということだと思いますけども、そこのリスクの把握がしっかりしていれば問題ないですし、あと自益者がちゃんと理解していれば問題ないわけですけども、そうでなければですね、長期的なリスクだけを見ていれば、おそらくそこの運用者は批判にされるということになりますので、この理解というのは極めて難しいというふうに感じています。で、3つ目の課題ですけれども、こちら、一番今日の先生方に期待したいところなんですが、市場の持続可能性向上、市場の底上げというものについての効果検証です。で、私どもも追加で運用会社さんにフィーを払ってますので、それに対する効果を国民に示すという説明責任があります。で、それは我々内部でも今努力をしているところですけれども、やはり世界的にも例がないことですので、大きなチャレンジだというふうに思います。で、ESG 投資が短期的な超過収益の源泉というふうに考えるのであれば、この超過収益を他の投資と同じように計測すればいいだけですので、評価は極めて簡単な話なんですけれども、私どもは2017年にESG 投資を始めた時からですね、市場の持続可能性向上を目的としているということを言っております。ということは、ベータですね。で、日本株で言えばトピックスがどれだけ改善したか。我々が投資をしなかった時のトピックスと、投資をした時のトピックスっていうのが比べられないものですから、それを分析っていうのをするというのは、極めて難しいことだと思います。で、ストラテジック活動の、エンゲージメント強化型パッシブなどの、評価というのも同じだと思います。で、できたとしても、そのアウトカム、インパクトを計測して、そのインパクトが実際にベータにどれだけ寄与したかという分析ということが、アプローチとして考えられるわけですけれども、そちらについても、そんなに簡単な話ではないということで、今日は3つ課題を出させていただきましたので、後ほど、皆さんから有益なアドバイスをいただければというふうに考えています。ありがとうございました。
はい。どうもありがとうございました。近年のですね、GPIF の ESG に対する取り組みとですね、それから、基本方針、そして、あれですね、3つの課題をですね、提示していただきました。今日、 ここにいるですね、鈴木先生、それからジュリアン・フランクス、マルコ・ベスト、それから私でですね、最近はGPIF のですね、ESG の活動に関するですね、分析も始めております。マルコ自身はですね、ヨーロッパ中心にですね、ヨーロッパのですね、年金基金のですね、分析もですね、取り組んでおります。そうした観点からですね、今出された課題に対してですね、どういうふうに考えるかと、我々の側のですね、リプライをですね、まず、マルコ先生にお願いしたいと思います。
So first of all, let me congratulate GPIF for your general investment program and the vision you give to this subject. In Belgium and in the UK, I use GPIF to teach my students what a well-designed, well-thought-through, responsible investment program looks like. The adoption of indices, the engagement, the voting, and the way it's integrated is extremely well thought out, and if you like, a model for asset owners around the world who take the subject very seriously. Not just because of the responsible capitalism nature of this, behaving responsibly, but also in terms of risk management. So that's really my punchline on this. So the slide, I really like the last slide, number 13, because it really gives you the essence of what the problem is. And I would say that we have a problem of confusion between what's alpha and what's beta. So if you go back to my sugar example, is the Coca-Cola brand, is that alpha or is that an inflated beta? What's the risk of investing in that brand? Now, if the world continues the way it is, and you are allowed to do harm to people by selling sugary drinks in plastic bottles, this might be a very good investment, low risk. If the world turns around and says, actually, we are fed up with being poisoned by corporations, or governments wake up and say, we are actually going to ban these things, this is a very risky, bad investment. So this is alpha or beta. So when you said it's very hard to measure beta, that's exactly what it is. But note, I didn't use the word ethics or anything of that nature here. This is a pure risk management calculation. Now, of course, it is linked to social things because the risk of investing in this company depends on the social acceptability of this type of irresponsible behavior. And it really depends on the attitudes of Generation Z in terms of the risk management. Now, you can also go beyond this and say, is it ethical for a pension fund to invest in products that cause harm to people? But if you like, that's then a question that turns to the preferences of who the beneficial owners are. And in that sense, that goes to the heart of BlackRock's project, for example, on voting choice, where you ask people, well, what are your preferences on this? And in the case of the Norwegian oil fund, the parliament told them to divest from coal because the parliament decided that that is what they wanted to do. Now note, these two things are not necessarily contradictions, because it might be that you ethically don't want to invest in coal. There might also be a very good investment case for not investing in coal, because you think that there's a carbon bubble, and actually when you control for beta, the returns on coal are inflated, and actually the returns are very negative because in the long run, because we have to stop digging coal out of the ground, and the current valuations assume that the coal mines are going to be able to extract the coal from the ground. So that's really why your slide number 13 speaks to me. And I'll have to say something about ESG ratings as well, but I've given already quite a long speech, so I'll stop at this point. And I might come back on ESG ratings where I'll have something to say as well.
先生いかがでしょう。
Okay. So this is a very rich agenda that will keep us busy for a long time. So this is a very rich agenda which will keep us very busy. So let me go through a few points fairly quickly. The short versus long-term risk, I think, is terrifically important. And your reference to Ukraine, the cost of extra energy to the United Kingdom is equivalent to the entire health budget spent on the National Health Service. It's extraordinary. And the response of the British government has been to fast track the sale of new acreage in the North Sea for gas and oil development. So a short-term risk entirely inconsistent with long-term risk. You know, security of supply, budgetary implications. It's very hard to throw those out and just confine yourself to long-term risk. So I think your example of Ukraine and its implications for energy and for the development of gas and oil is very important. There's a real conflict here, and you can't ignore the conflict. ESG and alpha. I would go back to the Hart and Zingala's point, which, if I could describe it in 30 seconds, what they say is shareholders should be allowed to vote on investment decisions that depress the returns of a company because that is offset by increases in welfare to the shareholders and their families. So forcing, if you like, you can only engage on ESG, you can only improve on ESG if it leads to alpha. I think is a narrow perspective. And I worry a little bit. If BP shareholders want to invest in negative NPV projects because it improves the air quality of their families, they should be allowed to do it, but it will be reflected in lower alphas. I think that's reasonable. And we shouldn't, I don't think GPIF would, I would be surprised if GPIF would say, oh, no, we don't agree with that. I would be surprised, but maybe you'll surprise me. How to measure the effects of engagements is really complicated. And we don't have time to, but if I could just give you one example, I suspect there are large spillover effects from these engagements. So this is why I think it's so far-sighted of you to undertake this, because by getting your asset managers to engage with X number of firms, the ones that they don't engage will be encouraged to pursue ESG activity. These are what we call the spillover effect. By the way, quite difficult to measure, but they're there, and that's why I think this policy of yours is so far-sighted. I'm going to stop.
まあ、お二人のからいただいたコメントで、まあ、おそらくその、まあ、気候変動の問題とか、その長期的な課題についても、まあ、実際はその投資家の経済的利益につながるんだという、いうお話をいただいたというふうに、理解をしておりますが、私どもももちろんそう考えていて、で、そういうこともあって、その気候変動を考慮した、指数を採用したりとか、しているわけですけども、ただその問題はやはりバランスで、その将来のこと、まあ遠くなればなるほど当然のことながら不確実性が高まるわけですので、その不確実性と足元の、まあ、リスクとのバランスを取りながらやらざるを得なくて、その将来の不確実性がより高まれば、まあそこの、例えばその、計測するデータの正確性がより高まればということもあるでしょうし、となればその長期的リスクをより考慮することができるわけです。で、あと、もっと大事なこととしてはですね、まあ、国によってその、 被保険者の考え方っていうのが違う部分もあると思うんですね。その長期的なリスクに対する、国民の理解というかコンフィデンスの強さっていうのが多分あるというふうに思います。で、私の、これは個人的な感覚ですけども、例えば、オランダとかはですね、かなりその国民のその、問題意識っていうかコンフィデンスが強いので、逆にそこに合わせた運用を行うってなれば、より考慮する形になるでしょうし、そういったものを、踏まえながらやらざるを得ないわけです。やることが、私どもの、使命だと思っています。ただ、我々は、プロフェッショナルとして、どう考えるかということは重要ですので、その問題を、しっかり理解いただくために、情報開示とか、分析っていうのが必要で、それは一つのエンゲージメントだというふうに思っています。それが、今やっているその2つの冊子になっています。
どうもありがとうございました。So would you like to reply again? No. So, please. No? Okay. Oh, please. Also to Shiomura-san's presentation.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I also briefly want to comment on the ESG ratings. Okay, and I think the graph that you showed of the non-correlation is very striking. And there are also studies that we have showing that even if you extend this to all these other providers that we now have, the correlation is not high across all these providers, which leads back to the point I made before. At the moment, these ESG ratings are a mixture between capturing opinion or opinions about what is ethical or responsible or irresponsible and risk management. And they pretend to be about risk management, but very often they are actually about opinions on whether you should be allowed or not to sell handguns in retail stores or not. Now, how does that translate into a score? I don't think we'll have convergence ever if it is about opinions on what is socially desirable and what is not. And that's the whole woke debate in the US, but you have similar debates in other countries. What is acceptable in terms of fishing, biodiversity, plastics, all these kind of things. However, when you take a real risk management perspective, that's different. If you take, for example, the environmental issue, CO2 is something that you can measure. So carbon emissions is something you can measure. And if you then base an E-score on CO2 emissions, and then you want to have a risk about a carbon premium or discount, you can calculate that on that. Same for food. You would want to know how much sugar is in the products of the companies sold, what the nutritional coefficient is, something like that chart. Now, if that's what these things are going to measure in the future, that should actually produce some convergence, because then they capture hard data that you can understand. But as long as we have this mixture between them capturing opinion and capturing things that help you to calculate risk, that's when you have this problem of non-correlation.
いいですか？ OK。それでは、この塩山さんのですね、コメントとその議論もですね、この辺でですね、ひとまず、終えまして、鈴木さん、質問等出てますか？そうです。はい。それじゃあ、時間も迫ってきましたのでですね、最後にいくつか、我々セットしたですね、問題は、その新しい資本主義っていうのが語られている中でですね、これからのコーポレートガバナンスの改革、どういう方向かっていうことを問題にして、いろいろと今まで議論してきたわけですけれども、ジュリアン・フランクス先生のですね、主題にしたストックリパーチャスっていうのは今、少し下火になったんですけれども、自社株買いが多くなってくることに対しては、批判的な論調もですね、日本では多くて、規制を加えてですね、自社株買いを少し制約しようという動きもあります。その背後にある考え方はですね、自社株買いを通じてですね、従業員 あるいは企業の成長を犠牲にしてですね、株主に利益が還元されているとかですね。あまり現実的ではないですけれども、自社株買いをすると株価上がるわけですけれども、それを想定してですね、報酬、株価連動の報酬をですね、引き上げるために、自社株を使っている。これがしばしば、指摘される批判の場合のですね、理由なんですけれども、こういうような動向の中でですね、日本に即した形で、今後のですね、自社株買いに対する規制、どういうようなお考えを持たれているか、ジュリアン・フランク先生にお伺いできればと思います。いかがでしょうか。
I think you raise a very important point. If a company is buying back 10%, if a company is buying back 10% or more of its share capital, and it's cancelling those shares or holding them in treasury for a long time, one worries that they're restricting the amount of cash available for investment. And the conventional corporate finance answer is, well, you shouldn't worry about that because, you know, if there are profitable investments, they'll somehow raise the capital. But I would have said that 20 years ago, but now I'm much older, or now I'm very old. I no longer quite believe that. I think management can be short-termist because of remuneration. And therefore, this is something to be monitored, the relationship between share repurchases, the size of share repurchases, and investment R&D. I think that's something to be concerned about. And I was a regulator. I'd want to look at that. And you know, as you say, we need the empirical evidence. But let's look for market failures first, and then we can talk about regulation.
どうもありがとうございます。リパーチャスに関してはですね、特に企業の成長可能性の評価っていうのが、非常に重要に、なってきまして、ジュリアン先生、20年前であればですね、マーケットに任せておいてということなんでしょうけれども、現在のですね、ジュリアン先生の見方はですね、慎重にですね、それぞれの企業のですね、現状を見て、評価するということが重要ということになるかと思います。自社株買いをめぐってはですね、これからも議論が進んでいくと思いますので、我々のですね、実証研究も深めてですね、それに貢献できるようにしていきたい、いければと思っております。もう一つ、時間、5時20分もありかけてますので、最後に近い質問なんですけれども、冒頭申し上げましたようにですね、2020年、コロナが世界経済ヒットして、世界は ESG のブームという雰囲気だったわけですけれども、ここに来てですね、少し世界の雰囲気が変わっているところがあります。で、例えば、新聞報道でもですね、ブラックロックに対してですね、これはアメリカのことですけれども、批判が両側からですね、厳しくなされていると。で、ブラックロック厳しい立場にいるわけですけれども、共和党からするとですね、ブラックロックはですね、環境問題に優しすぎるというかですね、投資家の利益をですね、軽んじ過ぎていると。で、共和党がですね、影響力を持つ州ではですね、ブラックロックに委託しないとかっていうような話が一方で出ていると。で、逆にですね、ブラックロックのですね、自決権行使の、特に ESG に関連したですね、自決権行使は手ぬるいというですね、見方も反対側からまた厳しく出ててですね、そうした間でですね、インデックスファンドのですね、これからの行動はですね、非常に重大な岐路に立たされているのではないかというふうに見ております。で、こうした現状と今後の展望についてですね、最後にですね、少しコメントをいただいて、このですね、シンポジウムを終えたいと思います。それでは、マルコ先生いかがでしょうかね、この問題に関しては。 So do you have any opinion, Mark, on that? On the perspective of the index fund for ESG activities.
Sure. So I think that BlackRock have been extremely wise to introduce this voting choice project, because it gets them around an impossible situation where they control de facto an increasing number of votes, and they cast these votes without instructions from their beneficiaries. And since these votes are no longer about so clear cut, it's no longer, if this is shareholder value maximizing, thou shalt vote yes, and if it's not, thou shalt vote no. And if Elliott come along and they have a value maximizing proposition, or Nelson Peltz comes along and has a value maximizing proposition at Unilever, I should vote in favor. When we have disagreements based on ethics or different valuations of risk, so beta, then you have people who have very different opinions on this. And to have one asset manager vote in one way for all the clients is increasingly difficult. So I think the idea to introduce choice on votes and to ask the clients for instructions is visionary, and I would predict that all the asset managers in the world will have to follow this example. Now, there are, of course, difficulties, as we know. So do you want to give people the right to have an opinion on every single vote? That doesn't sound feasible because they can't get informed. So the idea that they adopt a policy where they give broad principles of how they would like to vote, how they define, for example, responsible behavior, that seems eminently sensible. And then you will have people who provide guidance on this. And then you have professionals like BlackRock who execute the votes based on those instructions. I think this is a very wise thing, visionary, and this is definitely in that space the way forward for passive index funds.
この点について、GPIF としては、お立場上難しい面もあるかもと思いますけど、今の、なんていうんですか、コメントというかご意見みたいなのございますでしょうか。
今のマルコさんのお話をまとめるとですね、多分直接民主主義と間接民主主義どっちがいいのっていう話なのかなとは思うんですけど、でやっぱりその間接民主主義で、国会議員、代議士となったからには責任を専門性を持って、プロとして行動するっていうことが求められているわけだと思っていますので、そこの責任っていうのは、本来この、新しい仕組みがどうかは別として逃れられない話だとは思います。で、きれいにその倫理的なものと倫理的な以外のものっていうのは切り離せないんですけれども、やっぱり、運用者は、受益者のためにやる、投資行動するっていうことは、もう基本の基本だと思います。ですので、例えばアメリカで、今、二つ、分断された社会っていうふうに言われますけれども、分断されているのでどっちを代弁すればいいかというのは難しい問題ではあるものの、例えば気候変動の問題など、私どものその集計では今、世界の GDP の 99% の国が、脱炭素に向かって、動いているわけですので、それは投資行動としてそれを考慮しない方がおそらく受託者責任に反するところまで来てると思うんですね。その程度の問題というのはまだあるにしても、そこを全く考えないというのは、受託者責任に反すると、もう言えるような時代になりつつあるんではないかと、これは個人的に思いますので、その範囲においては、当然 ESG を考慮する、投資行動とかエンゲージメントというのはもう基本になっているんだろうというふうには、感じています。純粋にちょっとすみません、感想になってしまいました。
どうもありがとうございました。Julian, do you have some comments on that?
A quick point. First of all, I agree with Marco that this idea of democratizing voting and pushing it down to the original owners is a very good idea. And the technology is very much there to get it going. And this is consistent with the Hart and Zingala's view that shareholders should be allowed to, if you like, vote for things that reduce the profits of the company, but enhance the welfare of shareholders, their families, and their community. I have only one caution, and that is that we wouldn't want passive funds to use this as an excuse not to engage with management. It would be easy to say, well, if the decisions are going to be in the hands of the original owners, you know, let them invest. And I would say no, for obvious reasons of free riding. So there is a bit of a risk here, a little bit of a risk that the passive manager, I won't say BlackRock, the passive manager would say, this is a great idea because now I'm not responsible for governance. You all are. And we all know that free riding and all that, we know that will not work. So it mustn't reduce engagement.
Can I add something to this? Well, I mean, if you think this through, okay, you have the very interesting question whether a large asset manager global that works, that has assets from the state of Texas and the state of California can really have one stewardship team on its two stewardship teams. And they might appear at the company expressing opposite views. Is that possible to organize under the same asset manager? Or do you actually have specialization where you say, well, I'm an asset manager for the Californias of the world, and you have another set of asset manager that says, I'm an asset manager for the Texas of the world. But I don't see that what I said, Julian, is in contradiction with engagement. It just means that you then have to follow through, and your engagement has to be in line with your voting policies, because your engagement should be consistent with your voting policies. But you then have to really think through the stewardship function and your engagement team. So this whole thing is going to revolutionize the way that stewardship is organized in asset managers. I think we agree on that, right?
agree ということで。1時半から始めてですね、何時間になるんでしょう。4時間余りですね、議論してきましたけれども、そろそろ、開きに、したいと思います。4人の方々、貴重な報告をですね、どうもありがとうございました。皆さん、と言っても、ここはそこなに多くないんですけれども、ズームでご参加の方々も含めてですね、拍手をいただければと。
一応閉会の辞を、じゃあ。
で、それでは、最後に、なりますがですね、本日の会議、リエティとですね、それから早稲田大学、ビジネスファイナンス研究センター、高等研究所3社共催ということで、最後の閉会の辞をですね、ビジネスファイナンス研究センターの、からですね、鈴木さんが代わってですね、コンクルーディングリマークスをしていただけるということです。よろしくお願いします。
本日はですね、本来所長の長谷川がご挨拶するべきところ、どうしても予定が合わなかったものですから、私の方で代理でお話をさせていただきます。本日は経済産業研究所、それから高等研究所およびビジネスファイナンス研究センターの共催によるシンポジウム。これは我々のビジネスファイナンス研究センターでは第12回 WBS グローバルインサイトという結構大げさな名前をしてるんですけれども、新しい資本主義の下での企業経営権と ESG コーポレートガバナンス改革の新たなフェーズにご参加いただきありがとうございました。このシンポジウムでは、在日中のロンドンビジネススクールのジュリアン・フランクス教授、ブリュッセル自由大学のマルコ・ベヒト教授、東京大学の田中教授をお招きし、コーポレートガバナンス分野、会社法分野の著名な研究者、そして実際に年金資金を通してですね、投資家のガバナンスの促進を進めておられる GPIF の塩村様も加わっていただきまして、 日本企業の株主保有構造とガバナンスの変化、それに伴う機関投資家や物言う株主の役割について、海外の最新情勢と対比しながらディスカッションをさせていただきました。岸田政権によるですね、新しい資本主義という言葉によって、方針によってですね、安倍政権の下で進められてきたコーポレートガバナンス改革がどのような方向に進化していくべきなのか、この4時間のですね、セミナーではとてもカバーしきれないテーマだと思いますけれども、株主構成、株主による対話、アクティビズム、欧州の長期保有株主への議決権の付与の動向、そして年金のアセットオーナーによる ESG 投資の促進の試みなど、多くの学び、気づきがあったのではないかと思います。私どものビジネスファイナンス研究センターでは、日本、そしてアジアをリードするビジネススクールである早稲田大学ビジネススクールと一体になって、教育活動の基盤となる実践的な知の蓄積のための研究活動プロジェクトを国際的なネットワークを作りながら進めております。このグローバルインサイトという講演会シリーズは、そうした共同研究を行っている海外の研究者たちの知見を皆様と共有するために定期的に実施しておりますので、またですね、将来ご参加いただければと思います。本日ご参加いただいた皆様にはまず感謝するとともにですね、お忙しい中、論文発表、それからパネリストとしてご参加いただいたフランク先生、それからベヒト先生、田中先生、塩村様に、本日所要で出席できなかった所長の長谷川に代わりまして、改めてですね、お礼を申し上げたいというふうに思います。また、シンポジウムに協賛してですね、いろいろと事務手続き等のお力添えをいただいた経済産業研究所の皆様、それから高等生研究所の皆様、それから事務方としてですね、非常に細かいいろいろギリギリまで無茶苦茶なふりをして、仕事していただいた早稲田大学アカデミックソリューションのスタッフの皆様、本当にありがとうございました。主催者として改めてお礼を申し上げます。本日はご参加いただきありがとうございました。なお、よろしければですね、あとアンケートのサイトのリンクをお送りしていると思いますので、こちらの方にもご記入いただければと思います。今後の講演会の参考にさせていただきたいと思っております。本日はどうもありがとうございました。